The key turned in the lock on the other side of the door, and Mary Beth Corrington pressed her palm flat against the wood until the sound of footsteps faded down the corridor. 3 years. 3 years of that same turning of that same key. She had counted the revolutions once, when she was 19, and still believed someone would come for her. 1,092. She had stopped counting after that. The room was not a cell. Her uncle had been careful about that. There was a writing desk beneath the window, and a narrow bed with proper linens, and a shelf of approved books, and a fire that a maid lit every morning before the sun came up. There was a small mirror above the washstand that she avoided because her own face had become unfamiliar to her, paler than she remembered, with something hunted in the eyes. What the room did not have was a view of anything but the kitchen garden. What the room did not have was a door she could open herself. What the room did not have was a single human being to talk to, who was not paid to ignore her. She crossed to the window and pressed her forehead to the glass. Outside, the autumn rain was coming down in slow gray sheets, and the gardener's boy was running between the herb beds with a sack over his head. She watched him for a long time. No one who set foot on this estate knew she existed, because her uncle Wenlock Corrington had decreed 3 years ago that his ward was too delicate, too nervous, too unwell to be seen, and had accordingly folded her out of the world like a letter no one needed to read. The footsteps returned. 2 sets this time. Mary Beth straightened, turning from the window, her heart beginning its familiar quickened rhythm. 2 sets meant company. 2 sets had happened exactly 4 times in 3 years, and each time it had been a physician her uncle had hired to confirm that his ward was indeed too unwell to appear in society. The key turned. The door opened. Her uncle stood in the corridor, fleshy and irritable, his coat dusted with rain. Behind him stood a man Mary Beth had never seen before, a man so tall he had to duck his head slightly under the low lintel, with dark hair pushed back from a forehead that looked carved rather than born. He was perhaps 38. His eyes were the color of old pewter. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read, and for one strange, weightless moment, Mary Beth forgot to breathe. "Niece," her uncle said, with the careful emphasis he used when he wanted a stranger to understand her as an object rather than a person. "This is His Grace, the Duke of Thornbury. He is inspecting the estate as a matter of business. He insisted upon seeing every room. I told him this one was of no interest, but he has insisted." The Duke of Thornbury said nothing. He was still looking at her. "You must forgive her, Your Grace. She is not accustomed to visitors. She will not speak. She does not speak to anyone. It is the nature of her condition." "Is it?" said the Duke. It was the first time Mary Beth had heard his voice. It was low and flat and faintly amused, and something about the amusement made her spine straighten, because she recognized, after 3 years of her uncle's careful performances, the sound of a man who was not being fooled. "Your Grace," her uncle said, and there was a new thread of anxiety in it. "Perhaps we might continue. The library is the next room on your tour." "I will continue in a moment, Mr. Corrington. Leave us." "I beg your pardon?" "Leave us. 5 minutes. No longer. You may stand in the corridor if it eases your concern for her reputation. The door will remain open." Her uncle opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time in 3 years, Mary Beth watched him lose a room he had thought was his. He bowed stiffly, mouth working, and stepped back into the corridor. The Duke walked in, slowly, as though giving her time to object, and stopped 3 paces from her. "Miss Corrington." "I have nothing to say to you," Mary Beth heard herself reply, and her own voice shocked her, hoarse from disuse, sharper than she had intended. "And since it seems you have heard that I do not speak, you may consider your theory confirmed." Leave me alone." Something flickered across his face. Not offense. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction. "That," he said, "was a great deal of not speaking. Is that meant to be witty? It was meant to be accurate. Then be accurate somewhere else. My uncle has his reasons for keeping me from visitors, and I am not inclined to give him a new one. I am not a stranger." She had been about to turn her back on him. She stopped. "I beg your pardon. You will not remember me. You were perhaps 14. I was 6 and 20, and I was a guest at your father's house in the summer he died. I sat beside you at supper on the night of the hunt ball. You told me that the soup was undersalted, and that the violinist was playing everything a measure too slow. I told my friend afterwards that I had never in my life met a girl who listened so carefully to a room she was not supposed to be noticing. You could not have been listening to me. I was 3 chairs away. But you knew the soup, and you knew the violinist, and I have not forgotten it." Mary Beth's hand found the back of the writing desk and held it. "That is a lie. It is not. My father had 100 guests that summer. The violinist's name was Gleason. He had a scar on his left hand. He played the second movement of the Mozart too slow because he had taken laudanum for a toothache. I learned that from him later that same night, because your remark made me curious enough to ask. You were 14 years old, and you were correct about a professional musician, and I have remembered it for 12 years. She could not speak. Her throat had closed. "Why," she managed at last, "are you here?" "Your uncle has been selling off parcels of your late father's estate to cover debts he has not declared. Some of those parcels border land that belongs to my family. I have been contesting the sales. Today I came to inspect the boundaries and to make him understand that the contestation is formal and documented. He did not wish me to enter this room. That interested me. I insisted. And now I find that the room he did not wish me to enter contains his ward, who has not been presented to society, who has not been seen, who is listed in his correspondence as an invalid requiring complete seclusion, and who speaks with the voice of a woman who has not had a conversation in a very long time and has a great deal to say." The corridor was silent. She could hear her uncle breathing. "You should not have come in here," Mary Beth whispered. "I know." "You will make it worse for me." "I know that too. Then go." He looked at her for a long moment. His gray eyes did not soften. They settled, the way a blade settles when a swordsman has decided on the angle of his strike. "Miss Corrington, before I go, I would like you to know one thing. The tour I am on today was invented this morning. I've had a suspicion for some time. I did not come here to inspect boundaries. I came here to open this door." And then, before she could answer, before she could even understand what he had said, he turned on his heel and walked out. And her uncle's voice rose behind him in a stream of apologies that the Duke did not seem to hear. And the key turned in the lock, and Mary Beth Corrington sank onto the edge of the bed and stared at the door, and did not move for a very long time. The fire had burned low by the time Mary Beth could think in full sentences again. She sat on the edge of the bed, with her hands folded very tightly in her lap, because if she unfolded them, they began to shake, and shaking led to the maid reporting one of her episodes, and her uncle would send for the physician, and the physician would prescribe a double dose of the foul syrup that made her sleep 14 hours and wake feeling as though someone had poured wool into her skull. So she sat still and made herself think. I came here to open this door. The sentence rearranged itself in her mind a dozen ways, each more dangerous than the last. He had come here deliberately. He had known. He had not known what precisely, but he had known enough to invent a pretext, and he had used his rank to force her uncle's hand. He had come into this room the way a man comes into a room he has been thinking about for months, and he had said her father's name, and the violinist's name, and the color of the soup, and in doing so, he had proved something that terrified Mary Beth more than any of it. He had proved that she was remembered. For 3 years, her letters had been collected from her desk and burned in the kitchen fire. The maid who had once smuggled a note out for her had been dismissed within a week. She had assumed, by the end of the 3rd year, that she herself had become the condition her uncle described, that the drugged sleep had made her into an invalid in fact, rather than in fiction. And now, a man she did not remember had stood in her doorway and told her that she had been noticed once, 12 years ago, by someone who had not forgotten. Her father. Oswin Corrington, who had kept a house full of music and argument, who had believed, to the horror of his brother Wenlock, that daughters should be taught to read Latin and to manage estates. Her father, who had died of a fever so sudden that the doctor had not arrived in time, leaving a 15-year-old daughter and a will that placed her in the guardianship of his brother until her 27th birthday, or her marriage, whichever came first. Mary Beth was 6 and 20 years and 7 months old. Her birthday was 5 months away. She understood, suddenly, why her uncle's hands had trembled slightly when the Duke of Thornbury had refused to leave this room. 5 months. 5 months, and the inheritance reverted to her, regardless of her marital status. 5 months, and she walked into whatever remained of her father's estate and asked to see the ledgers. 5 months, and every irregular sale, every falsified claim of her incapacity, every document in which her uncle had signed for her, because she was too unwell to sign for herself, would be examined by a woman who could read Latin. Her uncle had not been keeping her safe. Her uncle had been running out of time. The fire popped. Mary Beth blinked. She had been staring at the hearth without seeing it. Somewhere in the house, a door slammed. Voices rose, fell, and rose again. Her uncle's voice, raised to the pitch it reached only when he was frightened. Another voice she did not recognize, calm and steady. A steward, perhaps. Or a secretary. The Duke had not come alone. Mary Beth rose and went to the window. In the yard below, 2 saddled horses stood steaming in the late afternoon light. As she watched, a second man emerged from the house and swung up into the saddle. She could not see his face, but she knew the set of the shoulders. He paused before he rode out. He turned in the saddle, and he looked up at her window. She was standing in full view. She did not step back. He did not nod. He did not smile. He simply held her gaze for the space of perhaps 3 heartbeats, and then he turned his horse and rode through the gate, and the secretary followed him, and the gate swung shut. Downstairs, her uncle was shouting at someone. She sat down on the floor. She did not know why. It felt important to be lower than she had been, as though the room might see her better if she made herself small. She drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and tried to think. He had said he had suspected for some time, and underneath that question, a worse one. I sat beside you at supper on the night of the hunt ball. She did not remember him. She had searched for him the moment he had spoken, and she had found nothing. She had been 14. A grown man to a 14-year-old girl is as invisible as furniture. But he had noticed her. He had noticed her so precisely that 12 years later, he could repeat what she had said about a violinist. He remembered because something about her had caught on him like a splinter and had refused to work its way out. Mary Beth pressed her forehead to her knees. She thought quite clearly for the first time in 3 years. I am in considerable danger. Not from him. The danger was from her uncle, who would have spent the hours since the Duke's departure understanding that someone had seen, and who would now, inevitably, move the problem. She had heard him shouting. She had heard the words moved, and tonight and arrangements. The key turned in the lock. Mary Beth stood up so quickly she swayed. She had time to smooth her skirt and to put her hands behind her back before the door opened. And she had time to arrange her face into the blank, soft expression her uncle expected. And it was as well that she had, because the face in the doorway was not her uncle's. It was her uncle's housekeeper, Mrs. Fenlow, a woman Mary Beth had not exchanged more than 10 sentences with in 3 years. And Mrs. Fenlow was white about the mouth. "Miss," Mrs. Fenlow said, and her voice was lower than Mary Beth had ever heard it. "Miss, you must listen to me. I have very little time. Your uncle is arranging for you to be taken tonight. He has called for the carriage. He says you are to be removed to his cousin's house in Northwold for your health. The coachman has been paid not to stop. Miss, there is no cousin in Northwold. I was in service with the family for 20 years. I would know. Why are you telling me this? Because the Duke of Thornbury's secretary spoke to me in the kitchen passage not 1 hour ago. He said that if anything unusual was to happen in this house tonight, I was to send word to the Griffin's Head posting in. He gave me 3 guineas. I took them because I have watched you, miss, for 3 years, and I have been ashamed." Something in Mary Beth, which had been frozen for 3 years, cracked down the middle. "I will leave the door unlocked. I will leave a lantern burning in the back scullery. The scullery opens onto the kitchen yard, and the yard opens onto the lane behind the stables. There is a gap in the hedge where the gardener's boy goes through to snare rabbits. You will have perhaps 20 minutes. If you are not through the hedge by then, you will be in that carriage, and you will not be in it alone. Your uncle's man Blackwood will be traveling with you." Mary Beth understood. Blackwood. Everyone in the household knew the name. Blackwood was the sort of man who was sent to a problem when the problem needed to stop being a problem. "Do you know where they mean to take me?" "I do not know, miss. I only know that Mr. Blackwood has packed a traveling case, and that the case is heavier than a case for a week's journey ought to be. Go now. I will be through the hedge. Tell the boy at the Griffin's Head." Mrs. Fenlow pressed Mary Beth's hands once, hard, and rose. At the threshold she paused. "Miss, there is a cloak in the linen chest at the end of the east corridor. It is wool, and it is dark, and it was your mother's. I have kept it. I did not know why." And she was gone, and the door did not lock behind her. Mary Beth stood up. She walked to the writing desk and opened the drawer in which she kept the 3 things her uncle had not taken from her: her mother's miniature, her father's ring, her grandmother's silver thimble. She put the miniature in her pocket, the ring on her finger, the thimble in her bodice. She took out her stoutest half-boots and laced them tight. She did not take a bonnet. A bonnet would mark her in the dark. On the way to the door, her eye caught the mirror above the washstand. The woman who looked back was pale and thin, but her eyes were gray, like her father's, and they were very bright, and they were angry. "Good," Mary Beth said aloud. "Good." The corridor was empty. She walked with the deliberate, silent stride of a woman who has had 3 years of practice in making herself unheard. The east corridor. The linen chest. Her hands found wool at once, heavy and soft, and the smell that rose from it stopped her heart for 1 full second. Lavender. Her mother had kept lavender in her drawers. Mary Beth had forgotten. She pressed the wool to her face for 1 foolish, useless moment, then flung the cloak around her shoulders and moved on. The back stairs creaked. Halfway down she heard a cough from somewhere below and stood perfectly still against the wall for the count of 30. The kitchen passage smelled of onions and smoke. The kitchen was empty. The maids were all in the dining room laying supper. Mrs. Fenlow had known exactly. The scullery. The lantern burned on the low shelf. The door was unbarred. She pushed it open, and the cold, wet air of the kitchen yard hit her face, and it was the first outdoor air she had tasted in 3 years that was not filtered through a window sash. Then she moved. The kitchen yard, the lane, the hedge. She could not see the gap in the dark, and she almost wept with the conviction that Mrs. Fenlow had been wrong. And then her hand caught on broken branches, and the branches gave, and she pushed through, and she was on the other side. Behind her, faintly, she heard the sound of a carriage being brought around into the front courtyard. She heard her uncle's voice, raised, asking a question. Not yet alarmed, inquiring. She ran. She did not know she could still run. 3 years of drugged sleep and short walks within a 12-foot room, and her legs carried her. When the first thorn caught her cheek, she did not stop. When her boot found a rabbit hole and her ankle turned, she did not stop. When she heard, far behind her, the first shout from the direction of the house, she went faster. The Griffin's Head posting inn was 4 miles along the Hartling Road. She had never walked 4 miles in her life. She would walk them now, because the alternative was Mr. Blackwood and a traveling case too heavy for a week's journey. She came out onto the verge. The rain began again, lightly. She turned north and began to walk. She had been walking perhaps 20 minutes when she heard hoofbeats behind her on the road. Not a carriage. Horses. 2 of them. Moving fast. She took 1 step toward the tree line before she understood, with a cold lurch of her stomach, that the hoofbeats were coming from the wrong direction. They were coming from the north. They would pass her on the road. She stopped. The road had no cover at this stretch. The horses came round the curve. 2 riders, 1 ahead, 1 following. The lead rider was a tall man in a dark greatcoat, riding hard. And as his lantern swung across the road, his face was lit for 1 brief, uneven moment, and Mary Beth Corrington stood very still on the verge of the Hartling Road, in her mother's lavender-scented cloak, and the first and only thought in her head was that the Duke of Thornbury had not, after all, gone home. The Duke reined in so sharply, his horse went sideways on the wet road, and for a moment he did not speak. He simply looked down at her from the saddle, as if he were confirming a thing he had already suspected, and did not quite wish to be right about. "Miss Corrington, Your Grace, you are walking on the Hartling Road in the dark. I am aware. Alone. I am aware of that as well." The horse stamped. The Duke swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the mud, and Mary Beth understood that her legs had decided they had done enough. She swayed. He caught her elbow before she knew she had tilted. "Yardley," he said without turning. "Fetch the carriage. It should be at the Griffin's Head by now. Tell Healy to bring it at the trot. Miss Corrington is not going to stand on this road while we discuss it." "Your Grace." The secretary swung back up, and his horse was moving before he was fully settled. "I am not going to fall," Mary Beth said. "I do not believe you. There is a milestone 10 paces behind us. We are going to walk to it." She did not argue. He walked her the 10 paces with his hand under her elbow, as steadily as if he were escorting her across a ballroom, and he did not ask her a single question about what had happened, and she understood he was not asking, because he already knew. "How did you know to come back?" "Your uncle sent for a carriage at 5 this evening, a carriage he did not normally keep harnessed. The head groom's boy is in the pay of an innkeeper at Linford who owes me a favor. When I received the word, I understood what was about to happen, and I turned the horses around. Mrs. Fenlow told me. She struck me as a woman who had been waiting for someone to ask." Mary Beth pressed her hands against the cold stone of the milestone. The rain was coming down harder now. She should have been making plans, but the hand of the Duke of Thornbury had not left her elbow, and she found that she did not want it to, and that want frightened her more than her uncle ever had. "Your Grace, what are you going to do with me?" He was silent a moment. When he spoke, it was quieter than before. "I am going to put you in my carriage. I am going to take you as far as Linford tonight, and lodge you at the Swan, which is kept by a woman who will ask no questions. In the morning, I am going to take you to my aunt at Ashendene, 3 hours to the south. She is the widow of an earl and the sister of the Lord Chief Justice, and there is no magistrate north of London who will sign a warrant that crosses her threshold. From Ashendene, you will write to your father's former solicitor in Holborn, a man named Partheridge. Within a week, you will have your own legal counsel. Within 5 months, you will have whatever remains of your father's estate, and your uncle will not. Mary Beth could not immediately speak. She had walked 4 miles at a stagger on the belief that she might reach an inn and sit by a fire, and this man was talking to her about solicitors and magistrates as if it were all already arranged. Why are you doing this? Because it needs to be done. That is not an answer. He looked down at her. In the lantern light, his face was half shadow and half pewter. Miss Corrington, there is a longer answer, but I will not give it to you on this road, with you shaking from cold. I will give it to you when you are warm and fed and have slept, and when you can tell me honestly whether you wish to hear it. Until then, the short answer will have to do. She closed her eyes. She could feel the silver thimble against her breastbone, and she could smell her mother's lavender from the cloak, and for the first time in 3 years, she was not alone in a room. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. I am thanking you now. He did not answer that. Behind them, faintly, came the sound of hooves, and within a minute the carriage had come up out of the dark. The Duke lifted her to her feet, with a hand under her elbow and an arm at her back, and she was handed up into a carriage that smelled of leather and clean wool. The Duke swung up behind her, bending considerably for his height, and sat down opposite her, with his knees almost touching hers. They traveled in silence for perhaps a mile. She watched the lamps throw moving patches of light against the interior, and without meaning to, she watched the line of his jaw in the shifting light, and she thought, I am 26, and I have never been in a closed carriage with a man who was not related to me. Your Grace, at the Swan, what will they be told? Nothing that is not true. Your Grace, I am an unmarried woman arriving at an inn in the middle of the night with a duke. The truth, at present, is a worse story than any lie you could devise. He was silent. The carriage rocked. You are correct, he said at last. I had not thought as far as that. You had thought as far as a solicitor in Holborn, and you had not thought as far as what to call me at the desk of an inn. No. Then think now. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The flicker of one. At the Swan, I will tell Mrs. Aubyn you are my cousin's widow, newly bereaved, being conveyed to my aunt for her comfort. Mrs. Aubyn will put you in the room behind the private parlor, which she reserves for guests who must not be seen. You will be under her roof as Mrs. Sterling for one night. In the morning, we will decide another name together, because my aunt does not put women on her visiting cards under false names. Mrs. Sterling. It is a name I gave at an inn 12 years ago when I was traveling with a friend, and not in a mood to be known. Mrs. Aubyn will recognize it. She will not ask who Mrs. Sterling is this time. You have done this before. I have done a version of this before, not this. What is this? He did not answer immediately. The carriage lamp shifted, and the light caught his face, and something in his expression was not composed. It was the first thing she had seen on him that was not composed. This, he said slowly, is the first time I have ever taken a woman out of a house against the wish of the man who held her. The carriage went over a stone. Mary Beth's knee knocked his. Neither of them moved. The Swan at Linford was a long, low building set back from the road, shuttered, with a single lantern burning above the door. The inn yard was empty, but for a sleepy ostler who took the horses without a word. Mrs. Aubyn was waiting in the passage, as though she had been standing there since sundown. She was a small, iron-haired woman of perhaps 60, with hands like a pastry cook's and eyes like a revenue officer's. She looked at the Duke once. She looked at Mary Beth once. She did not look at her again. Your Grace. Mrs. Aubin, my cousin's widow. Mrs. Sterling. She has had a difficult journey. The back parlor is aired and there is a fire. Will Mrs. Sterling take supper? Broth only. In the bedroom. She will not be disturbed before 9. I am taking the room above hers. My man is taking the room over the tap. Nobody else is to come down this passage until we leave. Your Grace. That was the whole of the conversation. Mrs. Aubin led them down a wainscoted passage and through a low door into a small paneled room with a fire laid, and a bed turned down, and the curtains already drawn. It was, Mary Beth realized, the room a woman prepared for another woman who had been running. Mrs. Sterling. Mrs. Aubin spoke to her directly for the first time. There is a bolt on the inside of the door, and a second on the inside of the shutter. Use them both. The wall between this room and the passage is thick. I will bring the broth in 5 minutes. She closed the door. Mary Beth did not sit down. She stood in the middle of the small, warm room with her mother's cloak still on her shoulders, and she began, very slowly, to shake. It was not fear. She had been afraid for 3 years, and she knew the shape of fear. This was the shape of a thing relaxing after it had been held too tight for too long. A single knock. Yes. The Duke did not open the door. He spoke through it. Mrs. Aubin will be at the door in a moment. I'm going up. Bolt the door after her. I will be on the floor, above. Second door on the right. If anything at all alarms you, do not call down the passage. Stamp 3 times on the floor. I will be at your door before you have finished the 3rd stamp. Yes. Good night, Miss Corrington. She heard his boots on the stair. She sat down on the edge of the bed and wept, without sound, for perhaps a minute. And by the time Mrs. Aubin came in with the broth, she had dried her face and was unfastening her cloak as if it were an ordinary evening. Mrs. Aubin set down the broth and went out, and Mary Beth bolted the door and the shutter, and ate because her body required it, and got into the bed in her shift, and did not expect to sleep. She slept for 11 hours without dreaming. She woke to gray light and the smell of coffee, and for a disoriented half-second, she did not know where she was, and then she did. She sat up, and the room did not spin, and for the first time in 3 years, she woke without the syrup weight in her head. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long minute, simply breathing, and counting the small sounds of the inn waking below her. A bucket set down, a door opened, a man's voice calling to another man in the yard, and she thought, with something close to astonishment, that she had not heard the ordinary noises of ordinary people moving about ordinary work in 3 years. There was a clean gown laid across the foot of the bed, plain gray wool, well made, sized for a woman a little smaller than Mary Beth, but not by much. Beside it, a folded piece of paper. She opened it. The handwriting was angular and economical, and unmistakably the Duke's. Mrs. Aubin's niece's second best. A good fit, I hope. Breakfast in the private parlor when you are ready. No hurry. We do not leave before 10. Tea. She read it twice. She read the tea twice. She folded the note very carefully and put it into the pocket of the gray gown. And then, because she was alone and no one could see, she pressed her hand flat against the pocket and kept it there a moment, as if the piece of paper were a small bird that required warming. She dressed slowly, because it was an unaccustomed pleasure to dress without hurry. She combed her hair with the comb Mrs. Aubin had set on the washstand, and pinned it up with the pins from her own hair, and she looked at herself in the small glass and saw a woman who was pale, but whose eyes were still gray and still bright, and were not, for the first time in memory, drugged. The private parlor was a wainscoted room with a window that looked onto a kitchen garden. The Duke was already at the table. He had been reading a paper, and when she came in, he set it down and stood at once, and he did not exclaim over how she looked or ask how she had slept, and Mary Beth, who had been braced for both, found that the absence of either was a kindness. "Miss Corrington, good morning. Your Grace. Sit. Eat. We will talk after." She sat. She ate. The food was simple and excellent, and her body received it with a kind of shocked gratitude. The Duke read his paper and did not look at her, and when she set her cup down, he folded the paper and looked at her across the table. "You asked me last night why I was doing this. I did. You are rested. Do you still wish to hear the longer answer?" She looked at him across the narrow table. The morning light was gray and clean. The fire was steady. She was wearing someone else's gown and eating someone else's food, and she was, for the first time in her life, entirely responsible for whether or not she heard the next sentence that was going to be spoken. "Yes." He drew in a breath, released it, and folded his hands on the table. "My name," he said, "is Aldrich Rensley, and I have known about your uncle for 4 years." Mary Beth did not speak. The fire popped. She waited, because she understood, with the part of her that had learned over 3 years to wait for the next sentence of a man who held power over her, that the best thing she could do with that one was to leave it room. 4 years ago my father died, and I came into lands that had been in some disorder. Among the papers, I found a correspondence with a solicitor named Partheridge of Holborn. Partheridge had also been the solicitor of your late father. He wrote to me shortly after my father's death, as a courtesy, to inform me that the new party to our longest boundary dispute was a young woman under the guardianship of her uncle, whom he did not expect to see in his office for some time. That was the first mention of your name I had ever knowingly encountered. I had sat beside you at a supper table when you were 14. I had remembered you, but I had not known, until that letter, that the girl I had remembered and the ward of Wenlock Corrington were the same person. Mary Beth did not move. I wrote back and asked Partheridge polite questions, framed as boundary questions. He mentioned he had written to the ward twice and received no reply, and that when he had called at the house, he had been told she was unwell. He was uneasy. But the ward was the uncle's lawful charge, and he had no standing to demand an interview. He told me because I asked, and because he was looking for a reason to be less uneasy. I was not able to give him one. 4 years ago. I was only a year into the locked door. Yes. And you did nothing. I did several things, none of them enough. I had my steward inquire about your uncle's affairs. I learned he was in debt and selling off parcels to which he had no clear title. I had my solicitor contest those sales formally, because formal contestation creates a paper trail. I sent a man to your village twice a year to listen in the public house. I learned the physicians who called at the house were brought from London, and that 3 different physicians had been used in 4 years. I learned, piece by piece, that what was being done to you was being done with care, and that the care was the mark of a man who knew what he was doing was wrong. Mary Beth's hands were folded on the table. It was taking effort to keep them still. Why did you not come for me 4 years ago? Because I had no proof. I could have walked in. Your uncle could have had me barred. He is your legal guardian. If I had forced the matter wrongly, he could have moved you within a week to a house I did not know, or if sufficiently frightened, into a madhouse. A man who signs a committal for his ward on the evidence of 3 physicians he has paid is nearly impossible to undo. I did not act because I was afraid of being the reason you disappeared into a worse room than the one you were in. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, he was still looking at her. Then what changed? 3 weeks ago, your uncle made an error. He attempted to sell a parcel bordering my land to a man who has been for a decade in my pay, without knowing it. In the paperwork, he submitted a document bearing your signature. I had a letter you had written to Partheridge when you were 15, thanking him for a birthday gift. He had sent me a copy when I asked for samples of your hand 2 years ago, for reasons I did not give him. The 2 signatures were written by different hands. Your uncle had forged yours. Clumsily, Mary Beth opened her mouth, closed it. That forgery is a criminal matter, not a boundary dispute. It is an offense for which your uncle can be arrested. But to bring the case, I needed a witness who could swear she had not signed. I needed you out of that house, done before your uncle understood what he had given me. That is why you came yesterday. That is why I invented the boundary tour. I did not, when I rode up that drive, expect to find you in the state I found you. I expected a coached invalid. I expected you would repeat what your uncle had taught you to repeat. I was prepared to come back a second time, a third. I was not prepared for what I saw when that door opened. And what did you see? He was quiet for a long moment. I saw a woman who looked at me the way a person looks when they have been underwater for 3 years and have just realized someone has brought a rope. I saw the girl from the supper table, older and thinner and entirely awake. And I understood that I had been right to be afraid for 4 years, and that I had also been a coward. Not for waiting, for not finding a faster way. Mary Beth could not immediately speak. Her throat had gone tight in a way she remembered from girlhood, from the last time she had cried in front of another person, and she had not cried in front of another person since her father's funeral. Your Grace, Aldrich, if you will, under this roof. The formalities are not going to survive the journey. Aldrich, yes. You said on the road that there was a longer answer and a shorter one. You have given me the longer. It is not the whole of it. He looked at her. The gray eyes were very level. It is not the whole of it, no. What is the rest? Miss Corrington, the rest I will tell you when you have chosen whether to hear it. I will not offer it to you 6 hours after I have taken you out of a locked room. There is a thing a man owes a woman he has pulled out of a house, and the first thing he owes her is that he does not make her owe him anything in return. Not a gratitude, not an obligation. When you are at Ashendene, when you are your own woman in the eye of the law, then, if you ask me, I will tell you the rest. The fire popped again. A log settled. Mary Beth realized she had not taken a breath for several seconds. That is an extraordinary piece of self-discipline, Your Grace. Aldrich, it is an extraordinary piece of self-discipline. It is required. Why? He did not answer. The door of the private parlor opened without a knock, and Mrs. Aubyn stood in it with a face that was entirely white. Your Grace, there is a rider in the yard. He's wearing your Uncle Corrington's livery, miss. He's asking at the tap whether a lady has been seen on the road since sundown. Aldrich did not stand up quickly. He set his napkin beside his plate with the kind of deliberate slowness Mary Beth had learned, in the last 18 hours, to recognize as the thing he did when he was furious. Mrs. Aubyn. Has he seen her? No, Your Grace. He came in at the front. I had him turned into the tap the moment I heard what he was asking. The tap is on the other side of the yard. He cannot see this window, and he cannot hear this room. Who is with him? No one that I can see. He has one horse. He is alone. How long before he thinks to ask at the stables? Not long. He is drinking a mug of ale my daughter set in front of him, which I instructed her to do. She is slow at pouring when I tell her to be slow. He has perhaps 7 minutes before the ale is finished. Good. Keep him drinking. Yardley. The secretary was already in the doorway, coat in hand. Your Grace? The carriage. Now, bring it round to the kitchen yard, not the front. Go." Yardley was gone. Aldrich turned to Mary Beth. He did not offer her his hand. He did not ask if she was afraid. He simply looked at her, the way he had looked at her, on the road, with the blade settled. "Miss Corrington, this man does not matter. Your uncle has sent him to ride the inns and ask a question. He will ride 3 more after this one. He will report that a tall woman in a gray cloak was seen at none of them, because by the time any of them has an honest answer to give, we will be 100 miles from where he is looking. But you and I are going to leave by the kitchen yard in the next 4 minutes, because I will not have him lay eyes on you, and I will not have him carry the description of your face back to the man who paid for it. Are you ready? Yes. Good. Your cloak is in the bedroom. Fetch it. Do not fetch anything else. Go." She went. She moved through the passage and into the little back bedroom, and she took her mother's cloak from the hook behind the door, and on a strange impulse, almost not her own, she took the silver thimble from the dish by the bed, and she put it back into her bodice, as she had done on the night of her flight, and she did not know why. She came back down the passage, and Mrs. Aubyn was standing at the kitchen door with Mary Beth's torn gray traveling gown folded over her arm, and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Bread and cold ham, miss, for the carriage, and a flask of tea. The tea is hot. Mrs. Aubyn, I do not know how to thank. Do not, miss. I have been in the trade 40 years, and I have done this twice before. Go. He is on his 2nd mug, and I cannot keep him there." Aldrich was at the kitchen door. He took the parcel and gave her his arm, and they went out through the kitchen yard and round the corner of the stable into the lane behind, where Yardley had the carriage waiting. Aldrich handed her up, swung up after her, and the carriage was moving before she had sat down. They went out of Linford by the back lane and along the river road for 3 miles, and only then did the carriage turn south onto the turnpike, and by then Mary Beth had been silent for a quarter of an hour because she was remembering, with a clarity that sickened her, how it had felt to hear the carriage being brought around into the front courtyard of her uncle's house. "Aldrich," he looked up. "If that man had come to the Swan 3 hours earlier, he would not have. Your uncle did not send him until he was certain you were not on the road behind his own carriage. He will have spent the night searching his own grounds and the nearest villages. It is only now, late in the morning, that he has expanded the search. We have a day, perhaps a day and a half, before he understands you are not in the north at all. And then he will come south, and he will come to Ashendene, because Ashendene will be the first place he thinks of when he has exhausted the other possibilities, and my aunt will meet him at her own door with a letter from her brother, the Lord Chief Justice, and he will go away very quickly, and he will not return. You are certain, Miss Corrington. I have spent 4 years being uncertain about you. I am not being uncertain today." She did not answer that. She turned her face to the window and watched the hedgerows go by, and she held the silver thimble against her breastbone through the wool of her gown. They stopped at Widdenham to change the horses. Aldrich went into the inn for a quarter of an hour to send an express rider ahead to Ashendene. Mary Beth remained in the carriage. She watched the ostlers change the team through the glass. One of them, a boy of perhaps 16, caught her looking and smiled at her. And Mary Beth, who had not smiled at a stranger in 3 years, surprised herself by smiling back. Aldrich returned. The carriage moved. A half-hour passed, and then an hour, and the turnpike rolled under the wheels with a steady sound that Mary Beth came gradually to understand as the sound of distance putting itself between her and her uncle's house. "Aldrich." "Yes." The rest of the long answer. His eyes were still on the paper in his hands. He went very still. "I said you would have it at Ashendene. I am asking for it now." Mary Beth. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She heard it, and she did not acknowledge it, because to acknowledge it would have broken the careful, fragile, shared pretense that they were still strangers. "I'm asking," she repeated. He folded the paper. He set it on the seat beside him. He looked at her for a long moment. "Not in a carriage, Miss Corrington. Not between stages. I promised you the rest of the answer. I did not promise it to you on a turnpike. I am a man of considerable self-discipline. Today is testing it. Do not test it further." She did not look away from him. "Why?" "Because I am tired, and because you are tired, and because you have been free for 19 hours, and you should not be asked to hear the rest of the answer from a man in a closed carriage on a country road. Some things are owed a room, and a fire, and a door one can walk out of. You will have it at Ashendene. I swear it. Not before." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, and she turned her face back to the window, and she did not speak again until the next change of horses. And by then, the light was going, and Ashendene was still 2 hours off. Ashendene was a long stone house set in parkland that had been planted 100 years before. The Dowager Countess of Ashendene, whose Christian name turned out to be Honora, and who refused, within 5 minutes of Mary Beth's arrival, to be called anything else, was small and gray-haired and absolutely erect. She took one look at Mary Beth in the gray wool gown and the torn cloak, said, "My dear child, you are too thin and too pale. We will begin with a hot bath." And that was the end of the Dowager Countess as a stranger. It was past 11 at night by the time Mary Beth was bathed and fed and put into a green bedroom on the first floor, the bedroom Honora had apparently chosen because it had a lock on the inside of the door that was oiled and worked and was operated only by the guest, and the key of which Honora had pressed into Mary Beth's hand without comment. Aldrich did not come up to the bedroom. The formalities he had set at the gate were now the formalities, and he would sleep in the guest wing on the other side of the house. Mary Beth locked the door from the inside because Honora had given her the key. She did not lock it because she was afraid. She locked it because locking her own door from the inside, the right way round, was a thing she had never done in her life, and she wanted to feel what it was. It felt exactly as she had hoped it would feel. She slept for 9 hours and woke in gray dawn light with her hand on the key under her pillow. She sat up in the bed, and she thought, with a clarity that was new to her and that she would remember later as the first morning of her own life, that she had asked for the rest of the answer yesterday, and she was going to ask for it again today, and she was going to ask for it in this house with a door that locked from the inside, and she was not going to be refused a second time. She dressed in a gown that Honora's maid had put out for her. She went down. The breakfast parlor looked out on a terrace, and the terrace looked out on a park that was the most beautiful thing Mary Beth had seen in 3 years. Aldrich was at the table with a paper. He stood when she came in. "Miss Corrington, good morning. Your Grace, you slept. I slept. I should like to ask you something after breakfast. Anything. The rest of the long answer." He nodded once. He did not argue. They ate. Honora joined them halfway through and conducted a brisk and entirely one-sided conversation about the roses that required no reply from either of them, which was, Mary Beth later understood, precisely her intention. At the end of the meal, Honora rose and said, "I have letters to write and a steward to bully. The south garden is walled and quite private, and contains one bench. I suggest you use it." And she walked out. Aldrich looked after her for a moment. Something at the corner of his mouth flickered. "Your aunt is not subtle. No. Shall we?" "Yes." The south garden had one bench, as Honora had said, and the bench faced a sundial, and they sat on it side by side, and Aldrich looked at his hands, and then at the sundial, and then at Mary Beth. And the morning light was gray and clean, and somewhere in the house, a door closed softly. And Mary Beth understood, without being told, that Honora had arranged for the house to go quiet for an hour. "Before I begin," Aldrich said, "I will tell you one thing. If you ask me the rest of the answer, you will not be able to unhear it. It will change the nature of what has been between us. If you would rather we stayed neighbors and solicitors, I will not be offended. I will leave Ashendene this afternoon, and I will write to you as a friend. It is an honorable path. I will not hold it against you." "Aldrich." "Yes." "Begin." He looked at his hands, the night at the supper table. "You were 14. I was 6 and 20, and I was bored and cold and unhappy, and I had been ignored by the girl I had ridden from London to see. And I was sitting 3 chairs away from you, and you were telling your father that the violinist was playing too slow. I did not form an attachment to a 14-year-old girl at a supper table. I am not that man. I formed, that evening, a picture of what a grown woman might be if she had been that child undamaged. I carried that picture with me for 12 years. He paused. He did not look at her. When Parthridge's letter came 4 years ago and I understood who you had become, I felt a kind of grief, because the picture I had carried had a body now, and the body was behind a locked door. I assumed I would be meeting a stranger. I assumed I would do my duty, free you if I could, see you settled, write to you pleasantly once a year, and let the picture die. That was the entire plan, Mary Beth, until the moment your uncle opened your door, and I stood in the corridor and looked at you. And then I saw your face, and the picture had not died. And the woman in the door was the woman I had imagined, only she was real, and she was furious, and she was telling me to get out. And I understood, in those 30 seconds, that I had not been waiting 4 years to rescue a stranger. I had been waiting 4 years to meet her. She could not speak. I did not tell you this in the carriage or at the Swan. I would not have you owe me a feeling as a price for a rescue. I am telling you now, in your aunt's garden, because you slept last night behind a door you locked from the inside, and anything you say to me in the next 5 minutes will be said by a woman who is free. That was the price I set for telling you. It has been paid." Mary Beth looked at him for a long moment. She could feel the silver thimble against her breastbone. "Aldrich." "Yes. I decided in the carriage yesterday that I was going to marry you if you asked. I did not tell you because I thought I was being ridiculous, and because I was frightened of being a woman who fell in love with the first man who was kind to her after 3 years. I am not being ridiculous. You are not the first man who was kind to me. You are the first man who was honest with me. That is a different thing." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Only a moment. Say it again. I am going to marry you, if you ask me. Not because. No. You are sure." "I am sure." He rose from the bench, and she rose with him, and he took her face in both of his hands, and for the first time in 3 years, and in her whole life at once, Mary Beth Corrington was kissed, and when he lifted his head, he was smiling in a way she had not previously seen him smile, and she understood that the blade had put itself away for good. "I will ask your aunt for your hand this afternoon. She will say yes and pretend she is thinking about it. I expect no less. The trouble with a happy engagement is that the world does not stop being the world the moment 2 people in a garden have understood each other." The letter came the following morning. It was addressed to the Dowager Countess of Ashendene, and it was written in a hand Honora did not recognize. She read it at the breakfast table, and then, with an expression Mary Beth had never before seen on her, she folded it and put it face down on the cloth. "My dear, I am going to ask you to read this. You are not going to like it." Mary Beth took the letter. Madam, it has come to my attention that your household at present includes a young person representing herself as Miss Mary Beth Corrington of Corrington Hall, whose uncle is presently detained on a charge of forgery. I write to you not as a friend, but as a party with a legitimate concern. In the summer of the year before her father's death, I had the honor of receiving from the late Mr. Oswin Corrington a private undertaking concerning his daughter's future disposition, made in the presence of a witness still living. This undertaking, though never reduced to formal settlement because of Mr. Corrington's untimely death, was of a nature my own family has always regarded as binding. I understand now that Miss Corrington is shortly to be disposed of in marriage. Before any such disposition is finalized, I should wish to call upon you at Ashendene to lay the matter before you. I remain, madam, your most obedient servant, Crispin Villacre. Mary Beth read the letter twice. She read the name Crispin Villacre 3 times, and she set the letter down on the cloth, and she said, very carefully, Honora. I have never heard that name in my life. Nor have I. My father never mentioned him. My dear child, my dear, your father is not here to mention anyone. Aldrich arrived at 1 o'clock. Honora had sent for him by express. He read the letter standing at the library window, and when he had finished, he turned around, and his face was the face Mary Beth had seen on the night road. Mary Beth, did your father ever, in your hearing, mention the name Villacre? Simply mention him? No. I have no memory of the name. Is there anything in your father's papers that mentions this man, or a private undertaking about your future? Nothing. I have read every paper Partheridge has sent. There is no such thing. Then I can tell you what this letter is. It is opportunism. A man who has read the report of your uncle's arrest in the London papers, seen that you are an heiress about to come into her estate, learned by gossip that you are at Ashendene and engaged, and written a letter deliberately ambiguous enough that he cannot be contradicted on paper. He is not proposing marriage. He is proposing to call and to see what falls out. What falls out? Money. The usual amount is a settlement of £5,000 to go away. He will not expect to get you. He will expect to get paid, not to continue embarrassing you. And if we refuse, he will write to the papers. He will offer the story of the hidden ward, now engaged in suspicious haste, with an inconvenient prior claim being swept aside. It will not matter that the claim is fabricated. It will be printed. Your reputation will be marked for a year. Honora said quietly, I have seen this done, my dear. The last time was 11 years ago. The young woman paid. She was never easy again. Mary Beth sat with her hands folded. The thimble was at her breastbone. Aldrich, I am not paying him. Mary Beth, I spent 3 years in a room because my uncle thought I was a thing that could be kept until I could be spent. I am not going to spend the first year of the rest of my life paying a stranger to go away because he has read a newspaper. I am not paying him. If he publishes, he publishes, and I will stand in a church with you, and the cloud will have to pass over us both, and it will pass, because nothing in a newspaper lasts a year if you do not feed it. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Miss Corrington, I agree with you, on one condition, that you permit me to write to Villacre in my own hand this afternoon, and to tell him, in terms he will understand, that if he publishes one line about you in any paper in this kingdom, he will find every one of his own affairs published in the same paper the following week, and that I am in a position to make that promise good. He is not the only person in London whose correspondence can be read. Let me write. You will not have to pay him, but I will not have you stand in a church under any cloud that I can prevent. She looked at him for a long moment. Right, he wrote. Honora supplied the paper. Aldrich sealed the letter with his own signet. The manservant who had carried Villacre's letter was given the reply along with a second letter, unsealed, informing him that his master was about to be ruined, and that he might consider, before reaching London, whether he wished to remain in that master's employment. No further letter from Crispin Villacre ever arrived at Ashendene. No line about Mary Beth Corrington ever appeared in any London paper. 6 weeks later, Crispin Villacre sold his townhouse at a loss and removed himself to the continent. That evening, after supper, Mary Beth found Aldrich in Honora's library, standing at the window in exactly the attitude he had stood in when he had read the letter that morning. She came up beside him. "You were very angry this morning." "I was. You are still angry?" "Yes." "At Villacre?" "Not entirely." She waited. "I have been angry all day at the fact that any man alive thinks he may still address you as property. Your uncle did. Villacre did. The world will do it again. I am angry because I cannot stand at every threshold for the rest of your life and have the first word. I am angry because I will have to learn to let you have the first word, as I should, as you deserve, as is the only arrangement that is going to work between us. I am not a man who has previously had to learn that. I am learning it today. I am finding it difficult. Aldrich. Yes. I am glad you are finding it difficult. Are you? Yes. It means it is real." He smiled then, at the window, at no one in particular, and she thought, with a peculiar calm, that this was the thing she had not known she was going to be given, a man learning something in front of her and telling her about it as he learned it. They were married 11 weeks after the engagement, on a clear, cold morning in March, in the small parish church at Ashendene village. There had been discussion about where the ceremony should be held. Aldrich had initially proposed his own parish church at Thornbury. Honora had argued, with considerable force, that a bride married out of the house she had first slept in as a free woman was a bride who knew where she had come from. Mary Beth had agreed, before Honora had finished the sentence. The rest of the 11 weeks were spent on what Honora called the practicalities, which meant a small army of seamstresses, a continuous correspondence with Parthridge about settlements, and one afternoon of genuine panic when it had looked briefly as though Aldrich's absent mother, who lived in Italy for reasons no one in the family had ever fully explained, might return. She did not. She sent instead a letter of considerable warmth and a string of pearls that had belonged to Aldrich's grandmother, and Mary Beth wore the pearls at the ceremony and wrote a reply that began a correspondence which would continue for the next 20 years. The Dowager Countess was seated in the front pew in a pearl-gray gown that had belonged to her own mother. Parthridge stood up with Aldrich at the altar, because Aldrich had no brother and no living father, and had declared, in private to Honora, that he would rather be stood with by the man who had put Mary Beth's name on the first piece of paper that had saved her than by any cousin he could summon from the north. Mary Beth walked the aisle on the arm of no one at all, because she had decided she would walk it alone, and she had explained her reasoning to Honora, who had wept once, and then said, "My dear, yes, of course, and you will walk it splendidly." She did walk it splendidly. She walked it in a gown of ivory silk that had been her mother's, altered to fit, with her mother's miniature pinned at her breast, and the silver thimble on its ribbon beneath the silk, and she did not tremble once. And when she reached Aldrich at the altar, he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "The soup is not undersalted today, Miss Corrington." And she laughed, in the church, on her wedding morning, which was not the conduct of a bride in the general line, but was, as Honora said afterwards, entirely in character. The criminal case against Wenlock Corrington had concluded 2 days before the wedding. He was convicted of forgery, fined beyond the value of what remained to him, and transported for 7 years. The house in which Mary Beth had been kept was sold at Parthridge's direction to discharge the remainder of her father's debts. The land on which the house stood was returned, under the terms of her father's will, to Mary Beth, who sold it within the year to a farmer named Millward, who had wanted it for 3 generations and had never been able to afford it. Millward sent her, every Christmas for the next 40 years, a crate of apples grown on the orchard that had been her mother's. Blackwood disappeared on the day of Corrington's arrest and was never heard from again. The wedding breakfast was held at Ashendene. Mrs. Aubyn was invited from the Swan and came in her best black and sat in the seat of honor because Honora had insisted. Mrs. Aubyn said approximately 6 words the entire afternoon, and at the end of the meal she pressed Mary Beth's hand once, hard, in the way she had pressed her hand in the back parlor the night of her flight, and said, "I knew you would do," and left without further ceremony. Mrs. Fenlow was invited and was not able to come, because she had by that time taken a position in a parsonage in Kent, but she wrote a letter that Mary Beth kept in the same drawer with the note signed T, and the letter from Crispin Velacher, which she kept on principle, because a thing you have refused to be frightened by should not be thrown away. Yardley, in a suit that was demonstrably new, danced once with Mary Beth after the breakfast at Honora's insistence. He was a careful dancer and a quiet man, and Mary Beth understood, watching him return her with a bow to Aldrich, that this was the man who had ridden with 3 guineas to Mrs. Fenlow's kitchen passage, and whose name she had not known for 48 hours after he had saved her life. She kissed his cheek. Yardley turned the color of a winter apple and bowed 3 times in succession and retreated to the punch bowl, and Honora, watching from her chair, laughed until her eyes watered. Late in the afternoon, when the last guests had gone, Aldrich took Mary Beth by the hand and led her out into the south garden, and they sat on the one bench, and they did not speak for some time. "Mary Beth, Aldrich, are you going to regret walking the aisle alone?" She thought about it. "No." "Why?" "Because I had spent 3 years with no one to walk beside me, and I discovered, in those 3 years, that I could walk. I did not want the first walk of my married life to be a walk I took on anyone's arm. I wanted the first walk of my married life to be the walk toward you. I will take your arm every day for the rest of my life after today. But I wanted this morning to be my own." He was quiet for a long moment. "That," he said, "was worth 12 years. Aldrich, yes, so was waiting for you." 3 years into her marriage, Mary Beth Rensley, Duchess of Thornbury, stood in front of the low door of a bedroom in the house that had once been Corrington Hall, and was now the property of Millward the farmer, who had made her welcome with the self-conscious pride of a man who had never before hosted a duchess in his kitchen and had spent a week painting his own doorframe in preparation. She had come because she had asked to come, and Aldrich had not asked her why. The room was not her room any longer. Millward's eldest daughter slept there now, and the bed was in a different position, and the shelf of approved books was gone, and the sewing frame had been removed and replaced with a small table that held a jug of wildflowers, and the mirror above the washstand was a different mirror. The writing desk was still there. The window still looked out on the kitchen garden. The key was no longer in the lock. The lock itself had been removed at Mary Beth's written request a year after her marriage, and a simple latch had been put in its place, and the latch was open. Mary Beth stood in the middle of the room with her hands folded in front of her. She was 31 weeks pregnant with her first child. She could feel the child moving as she stood there, the small, impatient turn of a body that had not yet learned patience, and had no reason to learn it. And she stood in the room where she had spent 3 years waiting, and she said, aloud, to no one, because there was no one in the room to hear her, "I am not going to carry you into this house. I am going to carry you out of it." She turned, and she walked out, and she did not look back. And in the passage, Aldrich was waiting for her with her gloves in his hand, and he gave them to her, and he gave her his arm. And they walked out of the house and across the yard and into the carriage, and the Millwards stood at their door and waved, and Mary Beth waved back, and the carriage turned south toward Thornbury, and she did not think of that room again for a great many years. There was a story, she told herself, in the first year of her marriage, when the quiet of Thornbury would occasionally come upon her, too heavily in the afternoon, and she would find herself standing at a window, counting her own breath. The story was that she had not escaped. The story was that the carriage ride with the Duke, and the Swan, and the garden at Ashendene had all been the hallucination of a woman drugged too often, and that she would wake at any moment in the narrow bed in her uncle's house. She told Aldrich about the story in the 4th month of her marriage. He had listened. He had not interrupted. He had not assured her that she was wrong. When she had finished, he had said only, "My dear, I will prove it to you as many times a day as you need." And he had. That week, he had come into whatever room she was in at 4 o'clock and said, "Come, let us walk." And they had walked the length of the South Park, and the sheep had scattered and regathered, and he had pointed out an owl and named 3 oaks, and on the 4th day, Mary Beth had realized that the story had not visited her that afternoon, because she had not been alone in a quiet room at 4 o'clock. From that week forward, for the rest of her life, she and Aldrich walked at 4 o'clock every afternoon the weather permitted, and on the afternoons when it did not, they sat together in the small library, with the door between them open to the passage, and she read aloud to him, and he corrected her pronunciation of the Latin, and the story did not visit her again. Their first child, a girl, was born in the spring. She was christened Oriel, after Mary Beth's mother, and her godmother was the Dowager Countess of Ashendene, who insisted at the font on being called Honora by the child in due course. Oriel was followed 2 years later by a boy, whom Aldrich named Thurston, after his own grandfather, and who inherited his father's eyes and his mother's memory for conversations she was not supposed to be overhearing. 2 more children followed in the next 6 years, and the house at Thornbury, which had been too large for 2 people, became the appropriate size for a family that filled it. Mary Beth discovered, in the rearing of her children, a talent she had not known she possessed. She read to them in the evenings, all 4 of them at once if the weather was cold, and she taught them Latin as her father had taught her, and she answered their questions without regard to whether the questions were convenient, and when they misbehaved, she made them sit on the library steps and read aloud to her until the punishment was done. It wasn't, she would reflect later, an ordinary way to rear a duke's children. It was the only way she knew, and the children grew up considerably less afraid of the world than their peers, which was precisely the point. Honora lived to see the first 3 of these children. She died in her 81st year with all of her faculties, in the green bedroom at Ashendene that had once been Mary Beth's, with Mary Beth at her bedside, and her last words, to the point in a way that was characteristic, were, "You did very well, child. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Partridge, who had become something like an uncle over the years, outlived her by 18 months, and left Mary Beth his entire legal library and a small silver inkstand. Mrs. Aubyn continued to keep the Swan at Linford for another 12 years, and Mary Beth made a point of stopping there whenever she traveled north. Mrs. Fenlow wrote twice a year from Kent until her death, and in every letter she asked after the children by name. Yardley became, in time, steward of the Thornbury estate, and then, after a decorous courtship, husband of Mary Beth's second cousin. Crispin Villacour died in Antwerp of a fever 10 years after his removal to the continent. No notice of his death appeared in any London paper, which was, in the end, a more satisfying rebuke than any notice could have been. The house at Thornbury in those years was known in the county for 3 things. First, for the astonishing quality of its library, which Mary Beth had rebuilt from the ground up in the first 2 years of her marriage, and which was accessible to any scholar of any rank who wrote in advance. Second, for its table, which was famous for being neither grand nor fashionable, but simply extraordinarily good. Third, for the fact that none of its internal doors had locks. All of the locks had been removed in the first year, by Mary Beth's instruction, and at the carpenter's considerable puzzlement, and latches had been put in their places, and the children grew up in a house where no one could be shut in anywhere, and did not understand, for some years, that this was unusual. On an evening in the autumn of the 7th year of her marriage, Mary Beth Rensley stood in the long gallery at Thornbury and watched the rain come down in slow gray sheets against the tall west window. And she thought, without wanting to, of another window and another autumn rain, and another woman who had stood with her forehead against the glass and wondered whether anyone was coming. Aldrich came into the gallery behind her. She did not turn. He stopped a few paces behind her because he had learned, over 7 years, that there were afternoons on which she preferred to be approached slowly. "My dear, Aldrich, you have been very quiet today." "I have." "Are you thinking of the house?" "I am thinking of the window." He came to stand beside her. He did not touch her. He looked out at the rain with her. "It rained that afternoon," he said. "The afternoon I came. I remember. I stood in the corridor before I went in, for rather a long time. I did not know, when your uncle opened the door, whether I would find a woman I could speak to, or a woman who had been drugged out of the capacity to speak. I was afraid, Mary Beth. I have not told you that. I had guessed. Of course you had guessed." The rain drummed. Somewhere at the far end of the gallery, their second daughter was shouting at her brother about something of great moment to a 4-year-old. Mary Beth listened to the shouting with the particular contentment of a woman who has produced noise in her own house by her own agency. "Aldrich." "Yes." "Do you remember what you said to me that afternoon before you left the room?" "Yes." "Say it." He looked at her. "I said, I came here to open this door." "Yes." She turned from the window, and she put her hand against his cheek, and she said, "You have been opening doors for me ever since. Every day. I have been meaning to tell you that for some time, and I have not said it plainly, because it is the sort of thing one means every day, and says perhaps once in a lifetime, and I wanted to be sure I was saying it at the right time." He put his hand over hers. "Mary Beth, I'm saying it now. I heard you." They stood in the long gallery for some little time, in a companionable silence that was the particular silence of two people who had once shared a more urgent kind of silence and remembered it. "Aldrich." "Yes." "Do you know what I thought? That first morning, when I woke in the green bedroom at Ashendene, and I put my hand under the pillow to feel the key? No. I thought, this is what the rest of my life is going to feel like. A key that I can feel with my own hand, not a key that someone else turns on me. And I thought, if that is true, I will not waste it. Have you wasted it? Not one day. I have been extravagant, Aldrich. I have been extravagantly happy, and extravagantly free, and extravagantly loved. And I have watched our children grow up in a house where every latch opens. If I were told tonight that this was all, I would not say I had been cheated. I would say I had been given more than was mine to ask for. Mary Beth. Yes. You are not being told it is all. Tonight is not the end of anything. It is a Tuesday in October. We have supper to eat. I know. I was only saying it in case I do not say it again. You will say it again. I will ask you to at every convenient opportunity for the rest of my life, because I have discovered that I am a man who likes to hear it, and I see no reason to deprive myself. She laughed. It was the particular laugh she had grown into over 7 years of marriage, lower than it had been at 14, warmer than it had been at 6, and 20. The laugh of a woman who had found a great deal to laugh about. After a while, their daughter came running down the gallery with her hair half out of its ribbon, and their son came after her, shouting that she had his wooden horse, and Mary Beth put out her arms and caught her daughter mid-flight, and Aldrich took the wooden horse out of his son's fist and gave it back with ceremony, and the argument was settled, and the four of them walked down the gallery together toward the drawing room where supper was laid. At the door of the drawing room, Mary Beth paused. The latch was open. It was always open. She put her hand against it anyway, because 7 years had not made the gesture unnecessary, and she pushed, and the door swung, and she went through. She had been hidden away so no man would see her. A man had opened the door. But the door, as it turned out, had never been the point. The point had been the woman behind it, who had counted 1,092 turnings of a key, and who had walked 4 miles in the dark in her mother's cloak, and who had stood on the verge of a road and thought, when a lantern came round a curve, that the man on the horse had not, after all, gone home. She had not waited to be rescued. She had walked out. He had come at the same time, from the opposite direction, which was not a coincidence, so much as the way the world occasionally arranges for 2 people who have been walking toward each other for 12 years to arrive at the same stretch of road on the same wet evening. That was the whole of it. That was the story. A locked door. A girl who had counted the key. A man who had remembered a violinist. And the long, slow, beautiful walk from the moment the door opened to the moment. 7 years later, when a woman pushed through a door that did not need to be pushed through, because she could, because she chose to, because she had learned that the difference between a prison and a home is not the presence of doors, but the freedom to walk through them. Thank you for walking with Mary Beth and Aldrich to the end of their story. They began with a locked door and 3 years of silence. They ended with a house full of children and latches that did not need to be turned. Every door in their life after that afternoon was one they chose to walk through, and that, in the end, is what a happy ending actually is. Not the absence of difficulty, the freedom to choose. If you have been moved by this story, please do consider subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell, because there are more stories on the way. More locked doors. More long, slow walks. More women who count the turnings of keys, and then, one evening, decide they have counted enough. Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories are told.